Good morning, brethren, and welcome to our bi-weekly program entitled The Word in a Glimpse, which is broadcast live on Facebook every Monday and every Wednesday at 8 a.m. West Africa time, which is 7 a.m. GMT. Today is Monday, the 21st of November, 2022, and our topic this morning is entitled Christians and Suffering, Part 3. Christians and Suffering, Part 3. We first want to apologize for not having any live broadcast last Wednesday, the 16th of November, 2022, due to some circumstances beyond our control. Anyway, last Monday, the 14th of November 2022, we said that there are four main origins of suffering in man's life: God, Satan, man, and nature. We then started talking of the suffering that comes to man from man. We said that man makes you suffer because because they envy you, because they are afraid of you, because they are jealous, or because they hate you, even for no reason at all. Let's now read in the Bible, in the Word of God. Let's read Genesis chapter 37. Genesis chapter 37, verses 3, 4, then 18 to 20. Genesis chapter 37, verses 3, 4, 18 to 20. Let's read. Genesis 37, verses 3 and 4. Now, Israel loved Joseph more than all his children because he was the son of his old age. Also, he made him a tunic of many colors. But when his brothers saw that their father loved him more than all his brothers, they hated him and could not speak peaceably to him. Now, verses 18 to 20. Now, when they saw him afar off, even before he came near them, they conspired against him to kill him. Then they said to one another, "Look, this dream is coming. Come therefore, let's now kill him and cast him into some pit, and we shall say, some wild beast has devoured him. We shall see what will become of his dreams." So today, we first want to point out the fact that the people who attack you, the people who make you suffer, are not always those that you can logically or legitimately think to be your enemies. Those who bring you suffering can also be among those who claim to be your friends, your best friends, or even your own family members. So those who hated Joseph, as we read in the Word of God, were his own brothers. They were not his legitimate enemies, they were his brothers, his own brothers. You know, Satan is very cunning. He can easily make your own brothers hate you and bring suffering onto you. He is always willing to divide and to disunite families. That's his job. Thus, suffering can come into your life from people who are closest to you, mainly your family members and your closest friends. This must not be that puzzling. In Psalm 41, verse 9, David said, even my own familiar friend in whom I trusted, who ate my bread, has lifted up his heel against me. And Jesus said also that man will have as enemies the people of his own household. And remember who betrayed Jesus? Remember who made it possible for all the suffering to come onto Jesus? Of course you do. It was Judas Iscariot, one of the 12 apostles, one of those who were closest to Jesus. And Judas certainly was one of those whom Jesus trusted the most, since he made him the treasurer of their team. You cannot appoint as a treasurer somebody whom you don't trust. Thus, it's not puzzling that your own relatives, that your own friends, that any other person very close to you may bring you suffering and may cause you to suffer. It's not puzzling at all. Yet the closest person, I want you to know this, the closest person to you is undoubtedly yourself. Yes, the closest person to you is yourself. And you also are likely to bring suffering onto yourself. Let's read 2 Samuel chapter 17, verse 23. 2 Samuel chapter 17, verse 23. Now, when Ahithophel saw that his advice was not followed, he saddled a donkey and arose and went home to his house, to his city. Then he put his household in order and hanged himself and died. And he was buried in his father's tomb. So here we see Ahithophel who killed himself, who hanged himself, so who brought suffering onto himself. The closest person to Ahithophel was Ahithophel himself. You see, your suffering may have been drawn into your life by yourself, which means that man as origin of suffering can also be self-imposed suffering. This kind of suffering is the one that can easily be avoided. It is the one that is easily evitable, especially when you are a born-again Christian. Though suffering is an integral part of man's life, including born-again Christians, this kind of suffering, self-imposed suffering, is avoidable. Self-imposed suffering is easy to avoid, especially for a born-again Christian. As we said, it's a matter of choice. It's a matter of decision. There are many ways by which people impose suffering on themselves. In the case of Ahithophel, for example, Ahithophel used suicide to bring suffering on himself. He hanged himself. You may say, well, he was dead, so he was no more suffering. But before he died, when he hanged himself, before he died, he suffered in his flesh. He suffered pain. So he had suffering on him. And suicide is also suffering because we will suffer eternally after that. So Ahithophel committed suicide because he couldn't bear, and he didn't bear the fact that his advice to Absalom was rejected, since it was found not as good as the advice given by somebody else, by another person, by another advisor, by another counselor. So he caused suffering to himself because of pride. Pride can make one do unthinkable things. Pride and stupidity generally move hand in hand. Yes, pride and stupidity generally move hand in hand. So the fact that Ahithophel's advice was not found relevant at that time, was it actually a reason for Ahithophel to commit suicide? Yet that's what he did. That's what he did because of pride. Another person who imposed suffering on himself was Judas Iscariot. Yet for Judas Iscariot, it wasn't out of pride that he committed suicide. It was out of remorse. So remorse too can be a cause of self-imposed suffering. But the result was the same, self-imposed suffering in the form of suicide. In the two cases, the case of Ahithophel and the case of Judas. There are also many other less radical forms of self-imposed suffering. For example, for any given reason, you are led to eat, let's say, rotten beans. No doubt you are going to experience huge suffering. If you eat rotten beans, you will certainly have sharp stomachache. You will have abdominal distension. And you probably will have diarrhea with or without vomiting. This type of suffering is not caused by anybody external to you. It is caused by yourself. And since it is self-imposed, this means that you can also avoid it. Self-imposed suffering is avoidable. You can avoid food poisoning because when you eat rotten beans, you are poisoning yourself through food. So you can avoid food poisoning. You can restrain your greed. You can restrain your gluttony. You can restrain your covetousness. Especially that as a born-again Christian, you cannot, or better, you must not indulge in greed. You must not indulge in gluttony. You must not indulge in any covetousness. You must not indulge in any covetousness. Thus, a born-again Christian is not supposed to suffer this kind of suffering, which is the consequence of greed, which is the consequence of gluttony, or which is the consequence of covetousness. Self-imposed suffering can also be the consequence of, let's say, dirt, or dirty lifestyle, or dirty environment. You see, living in a dirty environment or being dirty can cause a lot of suffering in your life. A bad lifestyle can cause a lot of suffering. It may bring sickness to you, and you suffer a lot for that. This one also is avoidable. Just cleanse your environment. Be clean. Another cause of self-imposed suffering is carelessness or recklessness. If you are reckless, sooner or later you will fall into trouble and suffering. Recklessness is a very dangerous way of living. Imagine, for example, reckless driving, or reckless eating, or reckless walking, and so on. Let's take this example. You want to cook meat. You go to the butcher, and you go to the butchers and buy meat. While at home, you wash the piece of meat that you bought and you place it in a plate to cut it into smaller pieces. But you are reckless and you don't put enough care in what you are doing. What is the next thing that is likely to happen? You certainly will cut your hand or your finger with the knife, which of course is very painful. In other words, because of your recklessness, you impose suffering on yourself. Self-imposed suffering. Imagine also that you are crossing a road, that you are recklessly crossing the road. For example, using your cell phone while crossing the road. And cars and trucks are at high speed on that road. It is very clear that you are about to be hit by either a car or a truck, and you may be either dead or seriously injured. This recklessness can cause much suffering. And self-imposed suffering can also be the consequence of doing things out of ignorance or stupidity. Let's read the last passage this morning, 1 Kings chapter 18, verses 27 to 29. 1 Kings chapter 18, verses 27 to 29. And so it was at noon that Elijah mocked them and said, "Cry aloud, for he is a god. Either he is meditating, or he is busy, or he is on a journey, or perhaps he is sleeping and must be awakened." So they cried aloud and cut themselves, as was their custom, with knives and lances, until the blood gushed out of them. And when midday was past, they prophesied until the time of the offering of the evening sacrifice, but there was no voice, no one answered, no one paid attention. You see, these prophets of Baal, we know this story very well. These prophets of Baal obviously knew that Baal would never answer them. Yet they stupidly wounded themselves so as to say that Baal would have mercy on them and answer them. So either these idol worshippers, these wizards, were ignorant or they were stupid. In either case, they wounded themselves, they imposed suffering on themselves, knowing clearly that what they were doing would not change anything, that Baal, who is an idol, would not answer them. They knew it. So they imposed suffering on themselves out of ignorance and stupidity. I may say it was out of stupidity, but if they ignored that Baal would not answer, then it was out of ignorance. So all these different types of self-imposed suffering are evitable. This is why we say that a born-again Christian is supposed not to suffer any self-imposed suffering, because it's avoidable and he can avoid it. So anyone, even those who are not born-again Christians, can avoid